Welcome everybody to today's webinar brought to you by the Clean Energy States Alliance. Today's webinar topic is food waste to energy. We have a really informative panel for you today. And to start things off, I want to go over a quick housekeeping slide with all of you who are logging on. Today we're going to have all of our participants in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You can listen to the audio portion of the webinar either through your telephone, or you can click on the radio dial for Use Mic and Speakers and listen to us over your computer speakers or a headset. If you are dialing in by phone, we ask that you please enter the audio pin in the space provided. So if you're on the telephone, you'd select the radio dial. It says Use Telephone here. If you're using your computer's mic and speakers, click on this radio dial here. If you're on the phone, please enter in your PIN. We're going to ask that all of you submit questions as they occur to you throughout the broadcast by typing them into the question box here and then hit the send box. This will be sent to Warren Leon, today's host. He will queue up the questions and ask as many as he can as time allows following all of today's presentations. So whenever a question occurs to you, please type it in. Don't wait to the end of the broadcast. They'll be queued up and then we'll answer as many as we have time. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll find today's recording as well as recordings of other previous CISA webinars on our website at www.cisa.org/webinars. So please check out. We have a plethora of information stored there. So with that, I'd like to introduce Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CISA, and he'll be today's host. So Warren, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks for joining us today, everybody. This webinar, as Maria said, is being sponsored by the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a national nonprofit organization that works to implement smart clean energy policies, programs, technology, innovation, and financing tools, primarily at the state level. And at the core of our organization is a national network of public agencies that are individually and collectively working to advance clean energy. And today you're going to hear from some of the staff of those agencies. Today's topic is one in which there's increasing and very rapidly growing interest in the renewable energy world out there, and that's the topic of converting food waste to energy. And we're going to hear about some very interesting and exciting activities both in Massachusetts and in Oregon. I'm going to introduce the two Massachusetts speakers now. They're going to talk. After that, I'll introduce the two Oregon speakers, and then we'll hear about Oregon. So you can see on your screen who you're going to be hearing from. Our two Massachusetts speakers are first Amy Barad, who's Program Director at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is a quasi-public state agency dedicated to growing the Massachusetts clean energy sector. She manages the Commonwealth Organics to Energy program, which provides financial support to developers of anaerobic digestion facilities. Among her wide-ranging prior relevant experience, she previously managed policy, planning, and regulatory issues for the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority's biosolids pelletizing facility and was a founding director of the Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Association. And she's going to be joined by James Doucette, who is director of the Clean Energy Results Program at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. He's had a long history at the department, and he's played several roles there, including helping to develop the regulatory changes that made the state's organic to energy program possible. So with that, let me turn things over to both Amy and James.
Hi, this is Amy Barad at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Warren, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to CISA members. I'll be coming back, but I'm going to turn over the first part of this to James Doucette.
Hi, this is James Doucette. So as we get started here, turning food waste to energy in Massachusetts it involves a lot of stakeholders, including multiple state agencies. Sorry?
Yeah, just double click on the deck and then it should work. There you go. We went by one too many.
Sorry about that.
We went.
That's fine. We have multiple state agencies that have roles to play in our clean energy program. We all fall under the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and I'm with the Department of Environmental Protection, and Amy's with the Clean Energy Center, for example. And so coordination has been a critical feature of our clean energy program. And one of the things we're trying to do is take a look at pre-existing policies and programs and adapt those as best we can to moving forward with some of our clean energy programs. So if we go back to our solid waste master plan that we put out in 2010, that's really the origin of our work on anaerobic digestion. The solid waste master plan set a goal of reducing our disposal of solid waste by 2 million tons by 2020, and as part of that 2 million tons, reducing our disposal of organics by 350,000 tons per year. Now, in order to do that, obviously, we need to develop some infrastructure to support that organics diversion. And what we set as a goal is 250,000 to 300,000 tons per year processing capacity. And anaerobic digestion is really the core of that. In addition, the master plan proposed establishing an organics waste ban. We have waste bans for a number of things in our solid waste regulations, and so we propose to add organics to that waste ban. That, by doing a waste ban, that can provide a driving force for the market so they can be guaranteed that there's some raw materials to work with if they build an anaerobic digester. In 2010, we already had capacity for some organics. Between farm-based and commercial organic, composting facilities, we had about 100,000 tons a year of capacity to manage that material, split between farm digesters and some large commercial, farm composters and some large commercial composters. In addition, we have a number of municipal and private leaf composting facilities. We do, as of 2010, we also had a number of AD facilities statewide. We have 6 wastewater treatment plants that use the AD for managing their biosolids. 4 of those also use the biogas for energy. We have 4 food processors that primarily use AD as a treatment mechanism for their effluent before they put the material down the sewer. And we had 2 dairy farms, one of which was under construction at the time. One dairy farm only used the material, used AD to manage their on-site manure. The other one was designed specifically to co-digest manure with food waste. And that one's the Jordan Dairy Farm. And Jordan Dairy Farm, in going through trying to figure out how to permit this facility, pointed out some of the problems that we needed to solve. We do not address anaerobic digesters in our solid waste regulations, and we kind of had to cobble together. Yeah, go ahead. We had to kind of cobble together a scheme to digest permit this digester. And so the way we did that is to look at it primarily as a recycling activity, and a big part of that was having our Department of Agricultural Resources issue a permit for the digestate to be used as fertilizer. So all the material generated by this digester would be, in fact, recycled in some fashion. But it pointed out the problem with our regs in that we don't address digesters. That provided no certainty for developers, for us, or perhaps concerned citizens about the next project and how it would, in fact, get permitted. So we needed to provide some kind of regulatory home for digesters and establish some appropriate standards for operation of these facilities. At the same time, if we wanted to make use of the existing wastewater treatment plant digesters, we needed to specifically allow in the wastewater treatment plant regulations that for source-separated food waste to go to those facilities without being regulated as solid waste facilities. So we had 3 different sets of regulations to revise. And the first of those were our solid waste siting regulations. We clearly did not want anaerobic digesters to have to go through the same siting process as a landfill, which can take 2 years. Clearly is designed for solid waste facilities as opposed to a digester. And so what we did was essentially exempt digesters from those siting requirements and develop a 2-tiered system for permitting them. If you're a farm-sized digester less than 100 tons per day, you could apply for what we call a general permit, which is essentially a certification process, and you will have to certify annually that you are meeting our solid waste, the regulations for that size digester. And then for larger facilities, we would issue a recycling, composting, or conversion permit, which is a normal sort of permit review by Mass DEP. And some of the requirements are on the screen in terms of the kinds of things that you would need to address. So the next piece of this was to modify the wastewater regulations to allow source-separated organics to go to a wastewater treatment plant. And that was a fairly simple thing to do. If a wastewater treatment plant wants to take source-separated organics, they need to revise their existing plant approval, and the department will review and approve that. And then the third piece of this triumvirate were our waistband regulations. We proposed to add organics to the waistbands. That regulation was issued in January and has an effective date of October 1st this year. And it will apply to generators of more than 1 ton per week of organics. We figure there's about 1,700 entities affected, but one of the things to keep in mind is that a number of those generators already meet our waistband because they divert material to an existing compost facility, for example. The waistband does not apply to wastewater residuals and does not apply to residences. And that's a key fact because when this thing was first rolled out, people jumped to the conclusion that we were going to regulate residential organics. Along with our regulatory efforts, we had a rather large stakeholder process to roll out our proposed regulations, get feedback from various interested parties, and to review the final regs before we went to public hearing. And then since we have issued the regulations, primarily the waistband reg, we have been talking to all kinds of generators, schools, colleges, hospitals, large food manufacturing operations, and so on, and have put together a number of pieces of guidance that are available on our website at the address on the screen, and there's 4 examples there. So we're trying to get out ahead of the actual implementation date of the ban so everybody knows what the rules are, and this thing will be implemented over a period of time. And now I'll turn this over to Amy, who can talk about incentives and some of the grant programs we have.
Thank you, James. So James was talking primarily about the sticks involved, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the carrots that we could offer and all the agencies that are involved in providing them. Before the waistband and the solid waste goals were even being discussed, we already had some production incentives in place that were helpful to anaerobic digestion. We do have an RPS in Massachusetts, and anaerobic digestion has been an eligible technology from the start. Then in 2008, another kind of portfolio standard was added. It's called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, and it is designed primarily to promote combined heat and power. So to the extent that an anaerobic digestion facility is using the heat in a significant way in addition to making electricity, it's potentially eligible for another kind of certificate, and it can earn both RECs from the renewable side and what we call AICs on the APS side. In 2009, our legislature made a significant move on the net metering front and allowed a number of different types of technologies to net meter at nearly the full retail rate, and that included farm-based anaerobic digestion. In 2012, the legislature expanded that, and net metering for pretty much all AD was included for facilities up to 2 megawatts in size. We also have a number of agencies offering grants and loans. The Renewable Energy Trust began offering grants for AD, or actually began making grants for AD-related projects as far back as 2006 with some of the feasibility studies for our farm-based digesters. In 2009, through efforts of the Department of Energy Resources and our electric distribution companies, there have been grants available for the installation of combined heat and power projects. Those are quite generous. Mass DEP was involved starting in roughly 2011 by offering grants through a municipal program to a couple of communities that were looking to put some publicly owned property out to bid to try to attract private anaerobic digestion developers to these sites. So some Mass DEP grants were instrumental in getting those projects started. Now that program focuses more on grants for capital expenditures in this area. My own organization, the Mass Clean Energy Center, began its Organics to Energy program in 2011. We offer grants for feasibility studies for anaerobic digestion, design and construction funds, and we also have an offering that's targeted at municipalities. It's pretty flexible. In addition to allowing them to do studies related perhaps to their wastewater treatment plant or putting a property out to bid for a developer, we also explicitly allow public boards like a planning board or a board of public health to use these funds to hire a consultant to help them evaluate proposals by other parties for projects that may be planned in their communities, just so that they have the technical expertise on hand to help them with the kinds of permitting that they need to do and engage in a well-informed professional way, and hopefully take away the incentive for them to just say no if they're sort of unclear or uninformed about the technology. And finally on this list is a recycling loan fund. This is a revolving loan fund that DEP has actually had since 1995, but in the last few years they've really prioritized projects related to food waste diversion. There are additional programs through tax-exempt financing and some small grants through our Department of Energy Resources, so the list actually goes on. We also offer technical support through different agencies. Most notably, I would say our Department of Agricultural Resources, they don't have a lot of funds, but they do have really super personnel who have been instrumental in helping farms evaluate this technology and hooking them up with funding opportunities at USDA and elsewhere. Our Department of Environmental Protection works closely with the organics generator community and helps point them in the direction of resources through the Recycling Works program. And DEP is also hosting the website where all the agencies are trying to provide a centralized source of information about the various grant and technical services programs they offer. DOER, Department of Energy Resources, has personnel out in the communities providing technical assistance. And the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center has, in addition to our grants, we've sponsored some roundtable discussions on hot topics in the AV community. For example, one about digestate usage and another one about initiating anaerobic digestion at wastewater treatment plants that don't yet have it, or introducing source-separated organics at wastewater treatment plants that do have it. In the future, we're looking forward to another significant incentive, which is a long-term contract opportunity for the energy and potentially for the RECs from anaerobic digesters. This is, again, an initiative of the legislature. It's got the awkward name of the Section 83A carve-out. But what it requires is that by the end of 2016, the electric distribution companies sign contracts of up to 10 or 20 years for renewable energy from a select group of emerging technologies. And in the aggregate, those contracts will represent 0.4% of their load, or about 200,000 megawatt hours per year. Our Department of Energy Resources was responsible for selecting the technologies that would be eligible, and that does include anaerobic digestion. The electric distribution companies are now developing. Sorry. Those solicitations are under development, and DOER and DPU will have roles in reviewing them. So the results that we've got to date, we have 3 farms with digesters that are operational, all of them taking source-separated organics. We have another farm that is working on a similar project. We have one small pilot-scale anaerobic digester at a public landfill that's under construction, and another much larger one that is under negotiation between a private developer and a public landfill. We have one supermarket distribution center that recently was permitted to construct an anaerobic digester. And if you're familiar with the Kroger facility in Southern California, this would work on a similar model in which the trucks that are returning from the supermarkets back to the distribution center would bring with them any expired food products, and they'll go to the centralized center and go into the digester. We have our largest wastewater treatment plant making some modifications so that it will be able to accept source-separated organics for co-digestion. And then we have 4 smaller wastewater treatment plants that are actively investigating either adding anaerobic digestion or adding source-separated organics to their existing digestion complex. And finally, we've got one municipally owned site that is out to bid, hoping to attract a developer to build digester there. So some of the challenges that we see, well, each proposed project has its own unique challenges, whether it's siting or community acceptance or permitting or financing. But one of the themes that we are seeing across the board is uncertainty regarding feedstock availability. As much as DEP might be a little anxious that enough capacity will show up in time for the ban, the developers are a little concerned that if they build it, will it come? and will there be too much competition for feedstock in the future? And the challenge in getting any sort of long-term contract around food waste is making it difficult in some cases to get financing. Another challenge is our net metering situation. The net metering, if you can get it where you're located, is a big financial advantage, but the distribution companies are not obliged to grant that beyond a certain amount, and in some cases those regional caps are filled, so that impacts the potential revenue stream for the digester, and again, it affects their financing. And then in the area of education and community response, people still are not terribly familiar with this technology and can be a little fearful about food waste showing up when it's not wanted. So there have been a couple of projects shot down for various related reasons, but we're hoping through additional education and outreach that the reception will be more favorable in the future. And again, all of the state agencies that have a role in this really are trying to stay in contact and coordinate and address all of these areas. So I think that's pretty much what we have to offer today. Here's our contact information, and we'll be taking questions later. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Amy and James. There's clearly a lot going on in Massachusetts, and it's an unusually coordinated, integrated program with all those agencies involved, and some folks have written in questions that we'll be asking in a little while. But now we want to put another state into the spotlight here and look at what Oregon has been doing, and we're going to be hearing a presentation from Matt Krumenauer and Dean Four, and let me tell you a little bit about them. Matt is a senior policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy, and he's been with the department since 2009. He serves as the program and technical lead for Oregon's bioenergy programs, and he's responsible for developing policies, strategies, initiatives, and programs to promote the development of renewable energy, alternative transportation fuels, and related industries in Oregon. Before coming to the Department of Energy there, he's held several previous positions, including serving as a conservation biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And he's going to be joined by Dean Four, who founded JC Biomethane, LLC in 2012. And he founded this company in order to design, build, own, operate, and maintain an industrial-scale biogas plant. He's a professionally registered engineer and also a professionally registered surveyor. He has more than 20 years of project management and engineering experience in industrial and residential development, in environmental research and research consulting, and in wine production. He founded Essential Consulting Oregon in 2005 with the mission of cultivating renewable business energy solutions for the agriculture and business communities. While they speak, keep typing in your questions, and I will ask them at the end, but let me turn this over to Matt and Dean.
Thank you, Warren, and thanks to CISA for putting on these webinars. They are extremely helpful, and I really enjoyed listening to our colleagues over in Massachusetts and what they're up to. As Warren said, my name is Matt Krummenauer. The Oregon Department of Energy is a state energy office that leads our policy planning and technical analysis for our energy system in Oregon, as well as manages a series of different incentive programs, a state loan program, and staffs our Energy Facility Siting Council. We are not a regulatory agency. We're separate from our utility commission, so we're really focused on trying to reduce the cost of energy for Oregonians by advancing energy efficiency and renewable energy. And I want to thank Dean for joining me today, because it's often best to hear from someone who's actually gone through some of the different things that I'm going to talk through. The first thing I wanted to mention is that anaerobic digestion, and specifically food waste to energy, is recently highlighted in our governor's 10-year energy action plan, which he released in December of 2012. This plan called for a coordinated approach to bioenergy opportunities that supports kind of key outcomes both for our environment, but also for thriving communities and a stronger economy, especially surrounding our natural resource-based industries in the state. And it specifically talks about encouraging integration of anaerobic digestion projects into composting and food waste collection programs to support not only increased energy generation, but also nutrient recovery. And I think that is a very interesting part, and one of the threads I saw in the Massachusetts presentation, and we're continuing to talk about, is that it really takes a broader look than just energy. And we're trying to move out of our traditional subject matter, regulatory and agency silos in Oregon to really develop a coordinated approach that meets a lot of these goals. And we've actually had a lot of progress to date. About 5 years ago, I looked and I saw there was about a ½ megawatt of a generation capacity from anaerobic digestion that wasn't located at a wastewater treatment plant. Now we have over 10 megawatts of capacity, including a 4.8 megawatt facility located at a dairy farm. We also have a number of other anaerobic digesters located at dairy farms. We've got 2 digesters at food processing facilities, with a 3rd under development. And we also have a number of our wastewater treatment facilities beginning to install receiving stations to intercept fats, oils, and greases and add them directly into the anaerobic digestion system, and looking at other types of feedstock for co-digestion. So we've seen quite a growth over the last few years in these types of projects, and we're seeing more and more interest in them. So I'll start just by giving you an overview of some of the policy and regulatory items. We have a renewable portfolio standard in Oregon. It was passed in 2007. It requires our investor-owned utilities to provide 25% of the retail load from eligible renewable sources by 2025. And they're actually doing quite well in complying with this. One of the interesting aspects of Oregon's RPS is that we allow unlimited banking of the renewable energy credits. And so there is a lot of credits being put into banks right now, both from the projects that the investor-owned utilities have registered, but also those projects that are eligible outside of Oregon in the Western Interconnect. And the last time I checked, a renewable energy credit in Oregon was worth about 88 cents, so quite a bit different from some of the other states that we see in terms of the value of that particular incentive. We've also spent a lot of time developing standard interconnection requirements, standard contract terms, and other conditions for small power producers, qualified facilities, or others wanting to interconnect into our system. That still provides a lot of gray area, but at least is a positive thing for some of these facilities. One of the challenges that we're working with now is that it is a separate type of process for working with our federal partners at the Bonneville Power Administration and the non-investor-owned utility service territory. So there's still some work to be done there, but there has been a lot of good work put into this. And we also offer net metering up to 2 megawatts for these types of projects as well under a much more streamlined process. Like Massachusetts, we also found out that when you start having anaerobic digesters take a variety of different types of feedstocks, they don't neatly fit into one regulatory construct. The on-farm digesters typically were regulated under our confined animal feeding operation permits that were issued by our Department of Agriculture. And that works until they start accepting a lot of nutrients that are generated off the farm. Then they began to look more like a solid waste management facility. But the only regulatory construct was basically to regulate them like you would a landfill. So our Department of Environmental Quality this last August unanimously adopted conversion technology rules. And there's a couple key aspects. One is that anaerobic digesters are treated similar to composting facilities with permit requirements located in the composting facility regulations. And this new permit classification was issued really based on the level of environmental and public health risk posed by the facility so that they could be regulated much differently than a traditional solid waste handling facility. And there are exemptions from permit requirements for very low-risk conversion technologies. And then there's a series of performance standards that all facilities must maintain. But essentially what our Environmental Quality Department did is provided a carve-out for facilities that were taking a variety of different types of feedstocks, converting them into energy or nutrients that's separate from the way we regulated anaerobic digesters on dairy farms and separate from the way that we regulated solid waste facilities or transfer facilities. And then there's also various municipalities in Oregon that are developing food waste collection programs, both for curbside residential programs that can be diverted into the composting industry or into anaerobic digestion. And also we're doing a little bit of work on industrial food waste. We have a large food processing industry in Oregon, and it's a right feedstock for us to look at producing different types of energy from. So switching a little bit into some of the incentives that we've been able to offer, we've had a business energy tax credit since the late 70s, and it was changed in 2007 from providing about 35% of the project cost up to about 50% of the project cost, and there was no budget on the program. Later session, the legislature put a cap for renewable energy projects at about $300 million over a 2-year period. And then, unfortunately, that program was sunset and replaced with a renewable energy grant program that is capped at $3 million for every 2 years. So we've seen quite the pendulum swing from being able to really have a lot of resources to really not having very many. And we're starting to look at how we can kind of normalize that pendulum swing a little bit. But we do still have some energy incentives available, particularly for combined heat and power plants. So this last year we were able to offer $8 million in tax credits for anaerobic digestion facilities that were able to use some of the heat in a cogeneration setting. So we are still able to provide some incentives to these projects, but they are nowhere near the level that they used to be. The Energy Trust of Oregon is also another entity in the state that is able to provide some incentives and assistance to projects like these. The Energy Trust is an independent nonprofit organization that's dedicated to helping utility customers benefit from energy savings and renewable energy generation. They serve the customers from some of our main investor-owned utilities and are able to invest some funds from our public purpose charge to help both with project development assistance. They're able to provide resources to help with feasibility studies or other project development work, as well as providing an incentive directly to the projects in terms of a capital incentive. And then the other program that is fairly unique and kind of interesting in Oregon is we have a biomass production or a biomass collection tax credit. And what this allows the state to do is provide a volume-based incentive to collectors of different types of biomass that are delivered to an energy production facility like an anaerobic digester. Used waste grease, used oil are eligible, food processing residues are eligible, different types of agricultural and forest-based biomass are eligible. And interestingly, when this was put into place in 2007, we used to be able to provide an incentive for municipal food waste. Unfortunately, through later legislation a few years ago, they removed that, the ability for us to provide incentives for that type of feedstock, but at least that precedent was there, and we're hoping to continue to improve on that. And then aside from these traditional or true incentive programs, we also manage a bond-funded energy loan program that we can provide term financing to renewable energy projects. And there's also a series of different local property tax incentives that can be used for renewable energy projects. So I mentioned our Department of Environmental Quality earlier. They are currently midway through a comparison of 4 different methods of managing food waste. They're looking at aerobic composting, anaerobic digestion, in-sink disposal to wastewater treatment plant, and landfilling. And the study is going to compare these 4 methods not only for their energy profiles, but also looking at greenhouse gas emissions and, importantly, impacts on soils. Many of us know that while soil quality doesn't garner the attention that renewable energy does, soil quality, nutrient management is extremely important and is often an undervalued element of the broader sustainability movement. So once that study is completed, the state will have a much clearer picture of what its priorities will be for materials management. We expect that we will be looking more and more at diverting organics from our landfills, but it's just a matter of what is the most appropriate destination for those types of materials. We're also looking at additional evaluation of utility regulatory issues, both from a power pricing perspective, but also looking at how the interconnection process, how our standard contracting requirements, and other aspects of renewable energy production and delivery, like wheeling charges, for example, could be used to help provide a clear development path for these types of projects, or hopefully, if we identify barriers, we're able to find recommendations to remove those. And then similar to some of the things that our folks in Massachusetts mentioned is we are also trying to get out the word on the benefits from these types of projects, both the wastewater treatment digesters, but also some of the other types of anaerobic digesters, not only communicating the benefits of the renewable energy, but specifically the co-benefits of the types of things that anaerobic digesters can do for nutrient recovery, water quality, and economic development. So as a quick overview of some of the things we have in Oregon, I wanted to turn it over to Dean now to give his perspective, because he's actually used a lot of these programs, gone through, and is currently operating a biogas plant.
Thanks, Matt. Everybody hear me okay, I assume?
Yeah, you sound great.
Thank you. Okay, thanks again for inviting me, or well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks, Matt, for setting me up to speak about our project. Matt has 2 slides here for me to speak to, and Matt, just leave it on that slide. That'd be great. And what I'll do is give a some specifications about our current situation, and then step back and talk about some of the development highlights or hurdles that we overcame, and then I'll maybe offer a few recommendations for others that are trying to support such projects or develop such projects. So Currently, you can see there on the screen our plant. So we have a very large white building. This is what we refer to as our reception hall. And to the left of that, which is actually northerly direction, there's a smaller tank with a white roof, and then a very large tank to the right of that, and then a dome-covered tank. Those three tanks are our mixed tank, digester, and post-digester, respectively. And that's basically our primary process there. The large footprinted tank to the right with the circus top tent is our storage tank for our liquid effluent. So currently, or I should say, we began processing food waste in July of 2013. So we're coming up close to our 1-year anniversary of processing food waste, and today we are processing at the rate of 350 tons per week of post-consumer food waste or commercial organics. That amounts to about 18,000 tons a year. And we're furthermore processing about another 100 tons per week of liquid high-strength waste. And that amounts to about 5,000 tons a year. So that liquid waste is things like fats, oils, and greases, in particular in our case, byproduct from a biodiesel production facility, and then also ice cream waste and other dairy production wastewater is what makes the balance of that 100 tons a week. The 350 tons a week of commercial organics or post-consumer food waste originates from the Portland metropolitan area, which, to give some perspective to the audience, is about 2 hours north of us. The way we receive that waste is in a dump truck with a dump truck trailer or a truck and pup. We have 2 of those truck and pup arrangements that arrive to us each of the 5 weekdays. That means we've received 10 truck and pup arrangements a week, each carrying about 35 tons. Those truck and pups actually originate in Eugene in the morning, carrying landscape supply material or recyclables north to the Portland market, and then they return to us in the late morning with food waste. So our transportation logistics allow for essentially no additional truck miles to get the food waste to our facility. In processing those 450 tons a week, we end up with about 10% rejects or packaging contaminants that are removed from that supply by our bioseparator, a Swiss-made product by the name of Hebag. And that packaging contaminants that we remove from the process is currently being landfilled. We don't know of a better alternative for it yet. And so that ends up in the landfill basically once a week, about 35 tons once a week. We are, through the anaerobic digestion process, generating enough methane-rich gas to run our combined heat and power unit and put on the order of 1,250 kilowatt hours continuously. So we're running our plant at about 75% of its design capacity. That is, we have the ability to put on close to 1,600 kilowatts. So we feel we're doing pretty well on that front, and are proud to be putting that renewable electricity to the grid. And then, of course, our other product or co-products, in addition to the energy, are the nutrients we recover. And we recover the nutrients in 2 forms, both a fibrous form that has a visual appearance similar to peat moss. Currently, we're producing not so much of this, maybe in the order of 3 tons a day or something like that. And then the balance of our recovered nutrients comes in the form of a liquid. We sometimes refer to it as a compost tea, but it's basically our liquid digestate. Currently, this is going literally across the street from our facility onto broad-scale agriculture. There's a farming family that receives our compost tea and takes it to their fields, and this will be offsetting in the range of 1,000 up to 2,000 acres per year of conventional fertilizer. They've further been able to get this blessed by the Oregon Oregon TILF, our organic certification body, to use it on organic acreage. So it is now actually being used on land that's growing organic food. So we're also quite happy with that. And that was to Matt's last point around seeing some added benefit from these kind of projects back into agriculture and ensuring that in fact this is done in a mindful way. So I'll jump to the development side and say that it is rather complex. From a developer perspective, I have somewhat jokingly, but it's not such a joke, have stated that this is almost impossible to get such a facility built. It is a very difficult thing to get financed, and that is one of the biggest obstacles to getting such a project off the ground. And so on the financing side, in our case and in most cases, the two big aspects that come into play there, of course, are both the supply of your raw substrate and then the offtake of your products. In our case, we're what is referred to as a merchant-style biogas plant. That is, we're not co-located with a supply of material. We are located on industrially zoned land close to agriculture, and everything we process comes to us. We have a supply agreement with Portland Metro, which is actually less than 5 years, but with extensions. And to Amy's point, the question of from a developer perspective, if they build it, will it come? I can jokingly say we were actually in that situation. We were long wondering, could we get the supply to adequate enough to support the business case? And yes, I can say if you build it, the supply will come, but that doesn't often satisfy the bank or other forms of debt providers. So we had quite a say complicated financing structure, which included senior bondholders, which were private investors, equity from an equity fund, subordinate debt, subordinate to our local bank, and then our local bank played a smaller role, about 15% of the debt. So I won't go too far off into that because that could take days to discuss. But furthermore, on our supply side, we're continuing to diversify. We're not only taking material from Portland Metro. As I mentioned, 350 tons of our 450 tons a week comes from there. Thanks, Matt, for jumping ahead. And so we're continuing to diversify in our supply. We're taking not only the liquid materials I mentioned that amount to about 100 tons a week, but we're also starting to take food waste from our local community of Eugene, and have been also shopping to take some food waste directly from some grocery store chains. On the offtake side of our facility, we were very much benefited from the hard work that the Oregon Department of Energy and the Oregon Public Utility Commissions had put in place, which allowed us to get a 20-year power purchase agreement with one of the investor-owned utilities. That was a very key element into our financing package, and without it, well, it would have been probably impossible to pull the project off. We were also very fortunate that we were able to get our liquid effluent into a farm in close proximity to our facility, so it was deemed an asset rather than a liability. That is, if you're a long distance from the agricultural outlet for these nutrients, it can become very difficult to economically get the nutrients back into agriculture. And as Matt alluded to, the conditions today for building such a facility are much different. We benefited from 4 different incentive structures. One, which was stimulus money that actually came through the Oregon Department of Energy. That allowed us to complete the design of our facility. Two, we were then also eligible, again with the Oregon Department of Energy, for a business energy tax credit, which we're just now finalizing. And then three, we were eligible for the federal U.S. Treasury's investment tax credit program, Section 1603. And again, we're just in the process of finalizing that. And then the fourth is an organization that Matt mentioned earlier, which is absolutely invaluable. One of our greatest allies is the Energy Trust of Oregon. They supported us with a $2 million incentive, production-based incentive over the first 4 years of our project, but they were in an agreement that lasts 20 years. That is, they front-load our incentive to facilitate our early years.
Hey, Dean, we should wrap up so we have some time for a few questions.
Will do. So those incentives, so unfortunately the wrap up here is those incentives are gone, and so replicating this project is near impossible from my perspective today. But I would just throw out three a few quick recommendations, and that is any way to secure the supply of material makes a private investment much more potential, higher potential. Any way to secure the offtake of both the energy and the nutrients. These things, the supply and offtake, are absolutely critical to get the investment and financing. And I'd like to note that two things. When we speak of supporting a project in the way of renewable energy, I think it's really key that as we go forward in trying to support such projects, we don't just have a myopic view that renewable energy is electricity. Renewable energy needs to be energy across the board, because the best outlet, most likely best outlet for biogas is vehicle fuel, not electricity. And I would just, one thing I wanted to mention was regarding net metering. That can work really well, but a biogas plant is a net energy exporter. So if it's aggregate net metering, where it could go across multiple meters, then that could be a real way to push biogas plants in the electricity domain. All right, so I'll rest here and look forward to questions.
Hey, thanks very much. I do have a bunch of questions. We were coming to the end of our allotted time, but I think we will go to about 10 after the hour, if that's okay with everybody. And so there'll be time for some questions. By the way, I got comments from several people saying, based on the pictures in the Oregon slides, they're moving next week. So one thing for Massachusetts, you have 1,700 entities that are covered by the organics waste ban. What are those 1,700 entities?
So they run everything from colleges and universities, industrial, food manufacturing, to large restaurants, you know, kind of the gamut of those kinds of operations. One of the things we're doing now is trying to survey some of those and figure out what they're doing today before the waste ban kicks in with their materials. Are they already diverting it to a compost facility, for example, so that they already meet the waste ban? A number of entities do that. Like a lot of the colleges already divert materials.
Okay, good. Here's a question that follows up on one of Dean's comments, but it's both for Massachusetts and for Oregon. And this person writes, in the grants for anaerobic digestion projects, do you count the heat energy contribution or only the electricity contribution? And if you do count it, is the heat for the digester itself eligible for any sort of incentives?
This is Matt with Oregon. I'll answer that. Our incentives have traditionally been based on a percentage of capital cost or percentage of total project cost. And so as long as they cross the eligibility threshold, the production is less of a factor than the actual project cost. And then in some of the feedstock-based incentives, we treat liquid fuels, thermal energy, and electricity equally.
How about in Massachusetts, Amy?
Yeah, and for us also, the upfront grants don't depend on the heat usage. We certainly want to encourage the heat usage wherever possible. The alternative energy credit is available only to those who use a significant percentage of the heat generated. So that production incentive does address that aspect of the project.
Okay. Here's another question for Massachusetts. Amy, you had a list of recent projects. How many of those had long-term contracts for RECs from the electric distribution companies?
For the RECs, I don't believe any of them.
Or long-term contracts at all with the electric distribution companies?
Well, the farm projects are all net metered, and when that kind of net metering means they have credits that they can allocate to other customers of the electric distribution company. That's a credit on that other customer's bill. So then it's the responsibility of the generator to actually have a side contract with whomever they are assigning the credits to for what that value will be. So it has to be in the interest of both parties. So even though the credit is worth nearly the retail value on the assignee's bill, they'll typically pay a little bit less than that to the AD owner, if that's clear.
Yeah. Okay, good. And here's a question for Dean about your biogas facility and some of your end products. Have any state regulatory agencies taken an interest in the land application of the compost tea effluent? Do they have concerns regarding things like trace metals or the nutrient content of the effluent on groundwater?
Yes, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has in fact taken interest in that, and admittedly, as was mentioned in some of the earlier presentations from the Massachusetts side, some of the regulations aren't quite up to speed with what we're doing. And so they asked us if we would kindly register our effluent as a soil amendment with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So we've been very forthright with both the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to share our testing of our material, as well as the Oregon Department of Agriculture to share our testing of the material. And yes, they have the concerns that you mentioned, but we have a very clean and good product to go back to agriculture. The concerns of heavy metals and or like pharmaceuticals, which can come off of wastewater treatment plants, are not so present in our facility because really we are dealing with food waste. So after the plate.
Good to hear. And this is a question for everybody on the panel, because in different presentations it's come up as an issue that financing can be difficult because of uncertainty about food supply for these facilities, and there is concern about some additional facilities coming on. Given that, how much really room is there to expand the market for these sorts of energy generating facilities in both Oregon and Massachusetts? Do you expect after the current projects in the pipeline get built that it's going to be real slow, or do you see room for a lot more?
I think in Massachusetts, if we get one big facility up and running, then that's going to probably, potentially result in other people looking around and trying to figure out if there's enough left. We feel that we could operate with several facilities, so it really kind of depends on what first comes in the door. You know, the farm projects we have are quite small, so they're not going to take a lot. And, you know, we don't have anything online yet that's going to, you know, be a big facility taking a lot of material. We did a food generation survey years ago and have tried to revise it a little bit to identify the sources. So a lot of the facilities being proposed are looking at that survey and to see where to try and locate.
And another point is there may be, in addition to those who are subject to the ban, there may be businesses who voluntarily like the idea that supports their green bona fides or whatever marketing to be able to say they're participating and this is where their organic waste goes. And that can extend even to neighboring states. Massachusetts is relatively small geographically, and we're seeing a lot of the proposals for siting these things clustering on the highways that actually, you know, connect to other states. So there are some parallel efforts going on in Connecticut and Vermont, and we're not too far from New York. So there could be movement of material across state borders as well.
And Matt, how about in Oregon? What do you see as the future there?
Hi, thank you. And I think that there is more supply than there is a market right now, really, meaning that, as Dean mentioned, it would be really tough to develop another project like his right now. So is there room from a supply standpoint? I think so. I don't know how many more there are, considering, you know, the entire state has less population than the Boston metro area. So there's just not as many opportunities there. But we also have a very large food processing industry. And so I think when you take some of that feedstock as well as some of the more municipally generated feedstock, there's certainly more room. There's a lot of organics still going into our landfills. But I don't think it's a massive number of new facilities that could be built.
Well, I have two more questions on the list to ask here, and one follows up on this issue of transporting the material to facilities. Has anybody done a study of the energy impacts of shipping the stuff to the facilities to get a sense of, you know, what's a reasonable radius where you get a good energy benefit from trucking it, especially if you don't have a situation like Dean has where some of the waste is going on trucks that would otherwise be running empty?
So this is James Doucette from Massachusetts. A number of the people we've talked to, particularly the the private industry looking at building these, has talked about a 30-mile radius as being kind of the distance for trucking, realistically. The other issue is for the digestate material. It's expensive to truck a lot of liquid digestate around to a farm. So if they're not near farms, some of the proposals are looking at simply adding the material to the sewer, which would be better than the raw material because you reduce the BOD and so on. So the 30-mile radius, at least around here, is what people have talked about.
On the other hand, there is a large anaerobic digestion facility in Maine, a good 5 hours or more, perhaps, from eastern Massachusetts, that is down here shopping for feedstock. So and part of why they may be able to do that is they're producing CNG that they're using in the trucks that are going to collect the feedstock. And they do have a long-term power purchase agreement at a favorable rate for the electricity. So that seems to be financially viable for them.
This is Dean. I can give my 2 cents. When it comes to radius, I think we often from my personal experience, I think that we have a little bit too narrow of a view that we think that being close to the supply of the material, the food waste, is the critical element. I can share with you that it is definitively not the critical element. The tail that wags the dog is being close to agriculture. The material coming into your plant will be about 30% solids. The material leaving your plant, particularly if it's wet anaerobic digestion, will be going out at about 3 or 4% solids. The facilities need to be close proximity to agriculture. If you have the nutrients as an asset rather than a liability, your radius for supply can stretch out to hundreds of miles. And yes, if you're selling CNG rather than electricity, you should be able to also reach a little bit further because you'll make, or should make, better revenue from vehicle fuel sales than electricity. So I think personally siting is one of the very most key elements. Getting it close to agriculture is what makes a plant really robust and viable. Particularly going forward in the future, these recovered nutrients will become more valuable, and in fact I believe they will become more valuable than the energy revenue.
And then let me ask one last question, if anybody knows the answer to this, and this has specifically to do with farm digesters. If there's a farm digester and it's fed with more than half off-farm material, does the farm still qualify under land use or other state and local rules as a farm? Perhaps I don't know the answer to that, but
yeah. So in Massachusetts, so far, the Jordan Dairy Farm actually brings in more material than they generate, that they use from the manure. It's about a 60-40 split. They use almost all the digestate, at least right now they use all the digestate on site to offset their fertilizer. So I think they're still viewed as a farm digester. They're not, so far at least, selling that material off-site, and I think that's where it begins to get kind of fuzzy. Our Department of Agricultural Resources does have some draft compost regs, which are, looking at that issue exactly. When does a farm suddenly become a commercial, non-farm entity?
any other comments on that one?
I can comment to the way it's seen in Oregon, and that is generally what's going on at the digesters located at a dairy farm is that they're not regulated by Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. They're regulated by Oregon Department of Agriculture. And Oregon Department of Agriculture regulates them predominantly on their nutrient management plan. That is, if they have adequate acres to manage their nutrients, then currently they're allowed to co-digest. There are some loose or voluntary, I think, caps that the Department of Environmental Quality would like to set, but I think it's pretty loose at this point.
Hey, well, thank you very much, and I want to thank all four of our speakers who had a lot of excellent information to share. This is clearly a interesting but complicated topic, and I think you all did a good job, and I'm sure if any of the folks in the audience have follow-up questions, our speakers would be happy to respond via email. Thank you all very much, and we will hope to see you on a future webinar.
Muted.
Energy State.
Unmuted.